disagreeing with you, because in Egypt you had revolutionaries who, some of whom died and were injured terribly in Egypt in order to overthrow Hosni Mubarak. They did not have a presidential candidate. They were not organized enough. Perhaps not surprisingly, the Muslim Brotherhood is probably the most successful grassroots organization in the Arab world. Unsurprisingly, they ended up successful politically, even though they had promised not to field candidates, which is another question altogether. But what do you do then? What do the revolutionaries do now that they've been essentially sidelined in many cases?
Well, the revolutionaries haven't been sidelined in Egypt. They haven't been sidelined in Tunisia. In a way, we're seeing leadership by the King of Morocco. He's the one who's now devolved power to a constitutional government. There's a prime minister now and a cabinet that has real power. That wasn't the case 18 months ago. So I'm not trying to put an unduly positive spin on all this, because I certainly see all the downside scenarios. But we're seeing leadership beginning to emerge in Egypt. There's no question about it.
From the revolutionaries, you think?
From the Muslim Brotherhood. And they were part of the revolutionary group in Tahrir Square.
Well, they didn't start it, though. I mean, they joined late in the game. But the revolutionaries, those secular, hipster, youngsters, the internet savvy, they are completely sidelined now. And when I was in Egypt a few weeks ago, in Egypt, yes, in Tunisia, less so. But you know, they were so depressed and chain smoking and in cafes and we don't know what to do anymore.
They weren't going door to door.
They were not going door to door, and that was something very interesting.
So I think we need to marry the tools. Let's remember, we are all stuck in the past a little bit. We're used to the democratic boots on the ground, the organizing in the districts, and that's what the Muslim Brotherhood did. We have to marry the new social media with that traditional boots on the ground to give the new political organizing tools to this next generation. And we have to start thinking outside the box and help them assemble the new toolbox of engagement. They don't know how to govern. But one thing I think it's important, Hala, for this audience to remember, Egypt has a rich history of a middle class. And Walter Isaacson has spoken so eloquently, and yesterday he referenced it again with Benjamin Franklin and his leather apron society. The middle class in Egypt is what our leather apron society was. It is why we need to invest in entrepreneurship, in these startup economies that are happening in the Middle East. It is some of the backbone that can help sustain.
But we're not going to invest.
Yeah.
We're not going to write the check.
By we, you mean the
not
U.S.?
the government. That's all thinking.
By we, you mean the U.S.?
Okay, the private sector doesn't care.
Yeah.
Okay, the private sector acts in the self-interest of the private sector. I used to work in the Commerce Department. We all worked in the same administration, but I'm sure we have a wide range of views here. And people would call from the White House and they would say, mobilize the business community. And I would say, there is no business community. Business follows its self-interest. Some businesses may help, but the United States is going to write small checks. The European Union is otherwise engaged and is going to write small checks. The people who've got to make this happen are the people of the region, and they have the cultural headwinds that you've talked about.
Yeah.
And there is also going to be a desire, and I don't think it's healthy, and I think we have to acknowledge it and grapple with it, of the United States and of the Europeans and of the Chinese to lean back a little bit and say, you know what we like in this part of the world? Stability. Yeah. We'll take stability. If democracy is a little bit longer coming, that's fine.
But
we can't afford the alternative. No,
but that's always been the case.
Exactly.
With the United States, among other countries, happily aligning itself with dictatorships.
Exactly. And I think that's going to have, there's a very good likelihood that that has a big comeback in the United States.
And including Saudi Arabia now. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, a very important, close and strategic ally to the United States. Let's talk now, let's get to the second part of our discussion and specific countries. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. An aging monarch, we have a crown prince, but he's in his 70s. What about that country?
I think Saudi Arabia presents the challenge to President Obama over the last 18 months. It's a very difficult one. How do we balance our hope for Jefferson's empire of liberty, that the Arab world might have some freedom, some route towards democracy, balance that interest against our more pragmatic interests? Yeah. What do the Saudis give us? Obviously, the energy lifeline is not so much to us. We're not dependent on Saudi oil. It's the Europeans, the South Koreans, and the Japanese, and the Indians. Secondly, the Saudis and the other Gulf states and Mubarak were very important in helping us contain and block Iran
Yeah.
and Iran's ambitions in the Gulf. And third, these conservative Gulf states and the other moderate Arab countries, the authoritarian countries like Egypt under Mubarak, helped us to thwart al-Qaeda. Those are very important interests. It would be a mistake, I think, if we said that's the choice throughout the Arab world. There are 22 Arab states,
Yeah.
each of them traveling at a different speed on different tracks towards some future, hopefully, of reform. And what the president has essentially done, and you can see this 18 ounce, he threw our support to Jefferson's empire of liberty, or to the Martin Luther King tradition, in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia. He did not do that in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, and
Or
to a
Bahrain.
and Bahrain. Why didn't he do it in Bahrain? Because the Saudis made a point of saying, this is our backyard, we need to have stability in Bahrain. The Saudis and the other Gulf states saw an Iranian threat through the Shia population in Bahrain, however right or wrong they were about that. I think the president has, largely in a very skillful way, tried to have 22 different policies. And he's been affirming of freedom in some places, he's been more conservative in others, and frankly, it seems to me that's probably the right mix for us.
Yeah.